Fatherhood is not for the faint of heart. It doesn't just ask for the minimum for time, for effort, or for money. It demands courage. And I think we all know this, hearing a baby screaming bloody murder, you're like, yeah, that takes real courage, to work with that. But of course, that is the sound of life, and it's a beautiful thing. And fatherhood indeed demands your life. I've only been a priest for about a year now, but even in that short time, I can attest to how frequently a father encounters his limits and then is asked to stretch even more. Fatherhood is not for the faint of heart, and it requires that boys become the men they're made to be. To be honest, it's obvious that there is a serious need for mature fatherhood today. Many men don't know how to be fathers, perhaps because they've never had a good example themselves. Or others simply abandon their responsibilities out of cowardice or out of a desire to be self-seeking bachelors for their entire life. I know that I have very little experience and a lot of learning to go, but in my own ministry, when I offer a simple word of encouragement or a blessing over someone's life, especially when they're in a difficult situation, it's almost like they're being offered water in a desert. People are starving to know their dignity, their purpose, and their identity. And it is fatherhood that gives these things. Think of St. Joseph. He did not beget Jesus himself, but he was tasked by an angel with naming the child. For when a father named a child at that time, even if he or she was not of his own blood, the very act of naming gave that child all the dignities and responsibilities of as if he were his own flesh and blood. The very act of naming, of saying yes to that child and blessing his or her future, bestowed dignity, purpose, and identity. Hence why, where there are spirits of rebellion and listlessness and irresponsibility and bitterness dominating the hearts of people, there too so frequently is fatherlessness. Should we therefore be surprised that when so many people reject the source of all fatherhood, God himself, that humanity faces a crisis of meaning, of dignity, and of identity? Or that when fathers fail to take the faith seriously, that their children really don't think it worthy of their consideration? If fathers are not mocked in movies and TV shows nowadays as weak and incompetent, you can just think of Homer Simpson as a classic example, or as tyrannical animals who just can't control themselves, then they're so often just discarded as unnecessary members of the family. Children don't need fathers, we're told. They can be replaced without harm. How then are men to be fathers in such an age? Especially when so many have experienced generations of dysfunctional fatherhood. Well, let's move to Scripture to see what we find. First, I want to point out the disciples' response. "Teacher, do you not care?" Of course, it's astonishing not only that Jesus is somehow sleeping through a storm on the open water. I mean, I've slept through my neighbor's house getting struck by lightning before, and that was pretty significant, but the boat is in danger of sinking, and Jesus is there just, calmly resting his eyes. Talk about being a heavy sleeper. So, we wouldn't fault the disciples for their fear, right? And their incredulity at the fact that Jesus is sleeping. Yet note that they don't just wake Jesus up. They question his character. Do you not care? That was Satan's temptation in the Garden of Eden, to doubt God's character, to doubt his fatherhood. Is God a good father, or isn't he? And so here it's the same temptation. Is Jesus good, or isn't he? Second, notice Jesus' response. Quiet. On the one hand, he himself is quiet as he's sleeping, and he can choose to be quiet as he wills. But on the other, just with a single word, quiet, he is able to silence the storm. I find it striking that the words "be still," that command, could also be translated "be muzzled," as if to say that when Jesus were silencing the storm, he were just muzzling an annoying dog. And furthermore, the same command is used by Jesus a few verses later when he quiets a demon who is possessing one of God's children. Jesus clearly has the power and the authority to silence any of his foes whenever he wants. Will he? Third, note the disciples' new response to Jesus. No longer fear of the storm, but a certain fear of Jesus himself. We read, they were filled with great awe, fear, reverence, and said to one another, "Who then is this whom even wind and sea obey?" The same question is directed at each of us. Who is this Jesus? But for us, it's not a rhetorical question. God is the answer. Because our first reading from Job and today's Psalm 107 make it clear that only God can silence storms. Only God can silence evil. Jesus is God. But does he care? Of course. He was named by his Father, Yeshua, which literally means God saves. Plus, he not only uses a word to silence evil, he also himself, as we know, is the Word, who was sent by the Father to silence evil. Do you not yet have faith? He asks. God the Father has revealed himself in Jesus Christ as the Father who will do anything to save his children. While we may be tempted to think him sleeping, and our own experience with perhaps neglectful or even abusive or just simply imperfect fathers has twisted our image of God the Father and caused us to doubt him, Jesus comes to set things right. He heals our lack of fatherhood, baptizes us into his own sonship, and shows us who the Father really is. We need never doubt God's good fatherhood, so long as we trust Jesus, the Word, spoken from the Father. How then are men to be fathers in our age? I defer to the opening lines of our gospel. They took Jesus with them in the boat just as he was. Fatherhood is not for the faint of heart. Just as being on a boat in a storm-tossed sea will cause even the most seasoned of sailors' hearts to melt out of fear, so too do we fathers tread on the deep waters of life, frequently weathering many a storm. So, take Jesus with you in the boat, just as he is. He may seem to you to be sleeping in that perhaps you're not even really sure if he wants to help, or you're not even sure what kind of power and authority he has to speak into your life situation. But trust me, you're a fool to think that you will go through this life without encountering those storms. And furthermore, that you wouldn't be better off to have God in your boat. Practically, what this means as fathers is, first of all, prayer. If you aren't praying daily, then you are, in effect, out of touch with the source of all fatherhood. And that will indeed have a negative effect on your children and your ability to offer them an image of God the Father. And I say this frankly because I know that when I myself shortchange my own prayer time, or if I put off going to confession, it's much harder for God to work past my sinfulness. Next, it means integrity. If you're going to bring Jesus with you in the boat, it means that you bring him with you everywhere. At work, on vacation, on business trips, in the store, in the car, and at home. Men of Christ are men of integrity who listen to their consciences and don't behave like self-seeking bachelors just because their wife and children aren't around. Integrity means you have virtue. And virtue, literally coming from the Latin word vir, or man, hence manliness. Possessing virtue means that it has become easy for you to choose the good, because you have practiced doing so and have built up that habit. And therefore, you can choose the good with ease, in season and out of season, for your spouse, for your children, and indeed, for your neighbors. Finally, it means growth. If you're not actively growing in holiness and actively growing closer to Christ, there's no neutral zone. It means you are moving away from Christ. That's why we need men and brothers who can help call us on, hold us accountable, and inspire and encourage and nurture the fatherhood within ourselves. So if you're over 18 and able to walk, then I look forward to seeing you at the parking lot at 7 a.m. on Saturday to join Fit Shepherds, because there you can become in the greatest spiritual and physical shape of your life. Whether you're single, married, widowed, or divorced, I look forward to seeing you join the sincere group of dedicated men. To my own father, and to all men who keep Jesus in the boat, thank you for putting your families before yourselves and working courageously to be an image of God the Father to the world. Thank you. It's not a job, but the self-gift that the world so desperately needs. Fatherhood is not for the faint of heart. But if we take Jesus with us in the boat, we have nothing to fear. Happy Father's Day.